In April 2025, thick fog blanketed the forest in southern Indiana, where ancient trees stood silently as if they had never taken their eyes off the past. The flashlights of the investigation team swept across the damp ground after heavy rain, pausing at an unusually sunken patch of earth near an old long-abandoned slope. "We've got a metal signal below the surface. Depth doesn't match natural terrain," one investigator said quietly over the radio, his voice tense in the still night. What began as a routine site check quickly turned into something entirely different, something that forced old files to be pulled from storage. Beneath the compacted soil, the forensics team discovered rusted metal fragments and traces of interference that time could not erase. Those objects did not belong to the forest, and they certainly did not belong to the year 2025. They belonged to the summer of 1964, the time when 4 young people left town and never returned. Michael Turner, Daniel Turner, Rebecca Lawson, and Thomas Lawson vanished after a short camping trip, leaving behind families waiting in despair. The search that year lasted weeks, but all it yielded was an abandoned vehicle, an unused campsite, and tracks leading into nothingness. Local newspapers called it Indiana's unsolved disappearance. With no bodies found, no suspects, and insufficient criminal elements, the case was closed with a cold conclusion: missing, cause undetermined. The town moved on, the trail gradually overgrown with weeds, and the story faded into collective memory like a vague warning. But more than 60 years later, that very ground began to give back what it had held. The new discoveries not only challenged the old conclusion, but raised an even more terrifying question. Who knew what really happened, and why was the truth buried for so long? As investigators followed each layer of soil, each file, and each decision from the past, the community's long-held trust began to waver. This was no longer just a story about 4 young people lost in the woods. This was a story about what happens when silence is chosen over accountability. The Indiana 1964 case is not merely a cold case being reopened. It is a chain of human decisions, where every act of looking away leaves consequences that stretch across generations. Today we will return to the summer of 1964, follow every forgotten clue, and step into a case where the truth has waited more than half a century to be heard. This is the story of disappearance, cover-up, and justice delayed, but never erased. Before we dive deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys into forgotten quests for justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Late August 1964, southern Indiana entered the final days of summer with the thick, characteristic air of the limestone forest region, where daytime heat still lingered in the narrow valleys, while evening mist crept down early, clinging to the winding dirt roads leading out of town. The days were fiercely sunny, but by late afternoon the wind suddenly shifted, carrying the damp smell of rotting leaves and wet stone, signaling an unstable night, the kind of weather locals still called unpredictable, especially in the ravine-edged forests where light faded faster than usual. That morning, Michael Turner drove the station wagon out of the familiar neighborhood, with Daniel Turner, Rebecca Lawson, and Thomas Lawson, 4 people carrying just a few simple bags for a short camping trip. Not to discover anything new, but simply to return to a place they had known for a long time, a stretch of forest not too far from town, close enough for everyone to believe it would be safe, familiar enough that they didn't need to say much before leaving. They departed in a light-hearted mood, no one in a hurry, no one showing any worry, and it was that very normalcy that made the morning pass like any other summer day, leaving no sign that it was about to become an indelible mark in the memory of those who stayed behind. In the early afternoon, the group stopped at a gas station along State Road, where the attendant later remembered them, because all 4 stood talking for quite a while beside the car, buying a few small items, and joking about how tough the forest roads would be after the rain. That was the last time they were seen with certainty, in daylight, amid the familiar sounds of traffic and the smell of gasoline. Nothing unusual except the ease of people who believed they would return, before anyone had time to worry. As late afternoon settled in, the sky turned a pale gray, a sudden cold wind swept through town, and by evening low clouds rolled in layers, obscuring the southern hills. Meanwhile, in the forest where they planned to camp, temperatures dropped faster than forecast, fog thickened hour by hour, swallowing the trails and distorting sounds, as if everything were being muffled in a damp, prolonged silence. That night passed with no word from the four, but at first no one considered it alarming, since previous trips had often lasted longer than planned, and in an era when communication wasn't always easy, silence sometimes simply meant an early night's sleep in the woods. However, when Sunday morning arrived, and noon passed with still no sign of their return, the waiting turned to worry. Calls were made to friends' houses, to places they might have stopped, but none brought answers. The clock in the house seemed to run slower, each hour stretching unnaturally, and by the time the sun began to drop low again, that worry had become a void, difficult to name. Sunday evening, loved ones began to gather, exchanging fragments of information, trying to piece them into a reasonable story to reassure themselves that everything was still under control, but the more they talked, the more they realized there was no solid detail to explain why the four still hadn't appeared. By nightfall, the silence grew heavier than any explanation, and in that moment, the only choice left was to admit what no one wanted to say, that something had gone wrong. The decision was made not in panic, but in the exhaustion and helplessness of people who had waited too long, and when the sheriff's office door opened to receive the report, it was not just an administrative procedure, it was the moment that marked the end of what seemed like a harmless trip, and the beginning of a long void, where four names were no longer tied to images of people who had left town in the summer sun, but to a question without an answer. When the families left the sheriff's office that night, what they left behind was not just a missing persons report, but a disjointed chain of information that forced the Monroe County law enforcement machinery to operate in a state of incomplete readiness. In 1964, such cases were usually seen as temporary, likely to resolve themselves with time, and Sheriff William H. Carter understood that mindset well when he accepted the file that very night, turning each initial note under pale yellow lamplight, listening to the details recounted in tired but determined voices, from the moment the four left town, where they planned to go, to the last time someone was certain they had seen them, all carefully recorded more as professional habit than as a sign of an emerging crisis. At the time of receiving the report, Carter did not yet consider it a criminal case, nor did he assign it any worst-case scenario, because in his many years working the county, he had handled plenty of cases of young people staying out in the woods too long, getting lost, or simply deciding to stay an extra night without notice. In that context, the most important thing was not speculation, but a realistic risk assessment based on what was known. The first questions were basic but crucial. Did they have wilderness experience? How much food did they bring? Were there any adverse weather factors in the area? And most importantly, had they been to the intended camping area before? Each answer helped determine whether this was a routine delay or a situation that could escalate quickly. Carter noted that the group consisted of 4 young people, not entirely inexperienced, traveling in their own vehicle, with no history of conflict or personal issues that might suggest voluntary disappearance, and the area they were headed to was not untouched wilderness. All these factors led him to temporarily classify the case as medium risk, enough to require early action, but not enough to trigger large-scale measures. However, what Carter could not delay was the time factor. A night had already passed, another day without news, and the weather forecast called for continued instability, with thick morning fog and scattered rain, conditions that could quickly erase traces if someone had indeed met trouble in the woods. For that reason, the decision to launch a search was made almost immediately, not as a panicked reaction, but as a necessary precaution to keep the matter under control. Carter's first order was to clearly define the priority area, rather than spread forces intuitively. Based on the family's information and his own knowledge of the local terrain, he initially focused on the area where the group planned to camp, concentrating on familiar trails, clearings commonly used as stopping points, and access roads, because if something had happened, it was highly likely to be within a reasonable radius of those points. Carter also noted that deploying too broadly at the start could backfire, diluting resources and causing any initial signs to be overlooked in the chaos. So he chose a step-by-step approach, starting by sending deputies to check key points that night, and preparing for a more organized search the next morning. Force assignment was carried out quickly but calculatedly, with deputies familiar with the terrain, paired with local rangers, while others handled communications, information logging, and maintaining contact with the families, to ensure all developments were updated without creating unnecessary expectations or alarm. In Carter's mind at the time, controlling information was as important as the search itself, because if a disappearance was sensationalized too early, it could bring unwanted consequences, from civilians flooding into the woods, to speculation that could derail the investigation from the start. The initial risk assessment was therefore adjusted continuously in those first hours, as deputies reported no sign that the group had returned to town, nor had anyone seen their vehicle on nearby roads. A small detail, but enough to rule out the possibility that they had simply changed plans and left the area without telling anyone. This complete absence prompted Carter to raise the case priority, not by declaring an emergency, but by preparing for a worse scenario if no specific leads appeared by morning. Meanwhile, he ordered a full review of all received information to ensure no detail that could affect the deployment direction was overlooked. The decisions in this phase, though they may have seemed cautious to the point of hesitation, actually reflected the standard investigative approach of the era, when balancing action and waiting was part of the job, and every step had to be weighed in the context of limited resources and the absence of modern support tools. By the end of the night, with the next day's search plan clearly outlined, Carter closed the file with the feeling that this case was no longer as simple as the ones he had handled before. Not because there was concrete evidence of a crime, but because the prolonged silence, and the coincidence of many adverse factors, had created an invisible pressure, forcing him to act faster, more carefully, and above all, to prepare for the possibility that what was being deployed was only the beginning of a process, far longer than anyone at that moment could imagine. The next morning, as the search plan was activated exactly as prepared the night before, the first piece of information that completely changed the pace of the case came from a deputy sent to check the roads leading into the forest south of town. He reported that at a packed dirt pull-off near an old trail, not far from the planned camping area, there was a station wagon sitting motionless since the previous night, with no one around. Just hearing the brief description, Sheriff William H. Carter immediately understood the significance of that discovery. The personal vehicle, if properly identified, would be the first tangible sign that the group of four had reached where they said they would, and had not left in the usual way. When Carter arrived at the scene himself, the car appeared in the dim morning light, with dew still clinging to the glass, parked slightly off the road's edge, as if the driver had only intended to stop temporarily, rather than abandon it for good. Identifying the vehicle's location immediately became a turning point, because it allowed the search team to anchor the entire investigation to a specific point, instead of continuing to grope blindly across the vast forest and surrounding roads. The condition of the car caused Carter and the deputies to linger longer than planned, not because of signs of violence, but because of the complete absence of them. The doors were closed, no broken glass, no fresh dents, and most importantly, the keys were still in the ignition, a detail that suggested both haste and contradiction with the fact that the doors had been carefully locked, as if someone had stopped in the middle of an unfinished decision. Inside, everything looked nearly pristine, with no obvious signs of disturbance, seats not flipped, dashboard not pried open, and everyday items like a folded map, a few note papers, and personal belongings still in place, creating an indescribable feeling that this car had been abandoned in a very brief moment, brief enough that those involved hadn't had time to think through the consequences. Based on the dew accumulation and the light tire impressions in the damp earth, Carter made an initial assessment that the car had been there at least since the previous night, most likely coinciding with the time the group was supposed to have arrived in the area. The fact that no one had returned for it after so many hours was impossible to ignore. If it had been a normal delay, the car would not have been left like this. From that moment, the station wagon was no longer just the group's means of transportation. It became the central anchor of the investigation, a fixed point around which every hypothesis had to revolve, from where they had gone after parking, to why no one returned, and whether there was any factor that forced them to leave the vehicle in such a state. Carter understood that how the scene was handled in this phase would directly affect the entire search, and although in 1964, the concept of scene preservation was not applied as strictly as it would be later, he still decided to restrict access, instructing deputies not to enter the car or move anything unless necessary for identification and ownership verification. Confirmation that the car belonged to Michael Turner was done quickly through the license plate and documents inside, which immediately reinforced the assumption that the group had reached the area as planned and ruled out the possibility that they had turned in a completely different direction from the start. In that context, Carter had to make a tactical decision: treat the car as an anchor point to expand the search outward, or handle it as an independent scene that needed thorough analysis before anyone ventured farther. He chose a balanced approach, allowing a small team to quickly sweep the area around the car for movement traces, while keeping the vehicle itself as intact as possible to avoid losing details that might later prove important. Faint footprints on the damp ground near the car were noted but could not be concluded, as the area saw frequent foot traffic, and distinguishing fresh from old tracks under such conditions was a challenge even for experienced people. However, it was precisely the absence of clear signs that began to make Carter uneasy, because the car seemed to tell no specific story beyond the fact that it had stopped there and waited in silence, offering no direct clue to where the four had gone. The decision on how to handle the scene was therefore elevated to a higher level of caution, with Carter ordering a diagram of the car's position, noting its orientation, tire condition, and interior details systematically, even though he could not yet know that these seemingly simple records would later be reviewed many times from different angles. As the sun rose higher, and the fog began to lift, the area around the car became clearer, but the biggest question remained unanswered: why did the four leave their vehicle here, and how did they do so without leaving any clear indication of the direction they went next? For Carter, this discovery was both progress and a reminder that the case was moving far away from the familiar scenario of a simple overdue trip, and from the moment the station wagon was confirmed as belonging to the missing group, every subsequent decision had to be made with the assumption that time was no longer on their side, even if no one was yet ready to say it out loud. From the position of the station wagon, the expanded search along the trails leading into the forest began almost immediately, and after traveling only a short distance, one deputy discovered the first signs indicating that the group of four had stopped here, not in a complete campsite as typically seen, but in a small clearing among the trees where the ground was flatter than the surrounding area, sufficient for a group to pitch a tent and rest. The very modesty of this location made it easy to overlook without deliberate searching. When Carter and the deputies approached the area, the first thing that caught attention was not what was present, but what remained unfinished, as though everything had been brought there but never used, creating an eerie feeling that this place had never truly become a proper camp. The tent was still partially rolled up, the fabric not yet stretched, the stakes not driven into the ground, the guy lines still tangled. There was no sign that anyone had slept inside. For those familiar with camping, this condition immediately raised the question of why a group that had traveled such a long way would fail to complete even the most basic step of setting up camp. The camp stove had been set aside, so clean it looked almost never lit, no smoke stains, no ashes, and the surrounding area showed no evidence of any meal having taken place, further reinforcing the sense that their stop here had been extremely brief, or had been interrupted before any real activity could begin. Food was found in separate bags, still in original packaging, unopened, undisturbed by animals, with no scraps scattered on the ground. Personal items such as clothing, sleeping bags, and a few small personal belongings were placed neatly, not in a hasty pile, but as though they had just been taken out of the vehicle and temporarily set down before any intention to organize them further. This very neatness particularly caught Carter's attention because in emergency or panic situations, campsites usually leave clear signs of chaos, whereas here everything appeared to have been left in a state of waiting, a moment abruptly interrupted rather than a deliberate departure. One of the most unsettling discoveries was the walkie-talkie found near the edge of the camp area. The device still had power, but instead of transmitting a clear signal, it emitted only a steady, faint static, as though attempting to tune into a non-existent channel. Although there was no evidence it had been used to call for help, the fact that it had been abandoned in this state made the deputies wonder involuntarily whether some attempt at communication had occurred and then been cut short. Carter ordered that no one touch the walkie-talkie until its position and condition were fully documented, because in a context lacking clear clues, even tiny details, such as the direction the device was facing or its distance from other items, could carry significance. Assessing the level of use of the campsite became the focus of the next few hours, as deputies combed every small corner for signs of activity, footprints, trampled grass, or scratches on tree trunks. The results, however, were inconclusive. Though footprints existed, they were not clear enough to determine timing or direction of movement, and the area had already seen prior human traffic, making analysis significantly more difficult. Carter noted that if the group had stayed long enough to properly set up camp, they would have left far more traces, from disturbed soil, deeply embedded tent stakes, to ashes from the stove, but the absence of these details led to a cautious conclusion that the campsite might have been only a temporary stop, or a plan never carried out. This gave rise to an uncomfortable hypothesis that something had happened very soon after their arrival, something sufficient to cause them to abandon setting up camp, yet not dramatic enough to produce obvious signs of panic, and it was precisely this gap in the sequence of events that turned the campsite into a strange scene, one that offered no direct answers, but only multiplied the questions. Carter had to decide whether to treat this campsite as a scene to be strictly preserved, or merely as a reference point in a broader search. In the end, he chose a middle approach, ordering detailed documentation of each item, their relative positions, and preservation of the scene as much as possible, while still allowing the search team to continue expanding outward. In his mind, this campsite was not the end of the story, but the point where it began to be interrupted, a marker of the moment when the four people's original plan ceased to unfold as intended. As the deputies left the area to continue their assignment, Carter remained a little longer, observing the quiet clearing among the trees where everything appeared to be waiting to be used. The realization that this place had never truly come alive as a camp made him understand that the search would not simply be a matter of following a clear path, but rather of piecing together absences, signs of things missing, and at that moment, it was precisely that absence that had become their greatest lead. From the never-completed campsite, Sheriff William H. Carter ordered a shift to the tracking phase, expecting that what the objects could not explain would be answered by movement on the ground. That very morning, tracking dogs were brought in using the standard method of the era, scenting from personal items left at the camp, then released along natural trails, leading away from the clearing in the woods, while deputies fanned out in a wedge formation to observe in parallel, noting every minor terrain change and every reaction from the dogs. Initially, the tracking proceeded relatively smoothly. The dogs picked up the scent strongly, pulling their handlers consistently away from the camp, crossing a stretch of open forest where the ground remained damp from overnight dew. For the first time since taking the case, Carter felt the search had latched onto something concrete, a route that could be followed, a sign that the four had left the camp together in the same direction, without scattering or panic. The scope of the scent trail obtained in the early phase gave the search team confidence they were on the right path. The scent did not fade immediately, but continued through several different points, sufficient to indicate recent human presence. Deputies noted that this direction did not perfectly match the main trail, but veered toward a lower strip of land where the trees were denser and visibility was limited, prompting the hypothesis that the group had deliberately left the familiar path for some reason, perhaps to find a better spot, or simply to avoid difficult terrain. However, after only about 200 yards, that consistency began to collapse. The dogs suddenly slowed, circled in an unremarkable area, then lost the scent entirely, not gradually as with an aging trail, but abruptly, as though it had been severed. The entire team had to halt to reassess. This complete scent loss quickly became the center of attention, not because it provided answers, but because it negated everything previously established. If the four had continued onward, the scent should have persisted, even if weaker. If they had turned back, the trail would have overlapped the original route. Here, there was no evidence of either possibility. Carter ordered the tracking procedure repeated from multiple starting points, using different personal items to ensure the result was not influenced by a single factor. Each attempt led to the same conclusion: the scent existed within a limited range, then vanished. No continuation, no branching, no return, leaving an inexplicable void that could not be accounted for by ordinary logic of ground movement. The absence of any sign of return or continuation forced the team to expand the search around the point of loss, combing every square meter in hopes of finding some overlooked detail. The terrain, however, did not cooperate. Uneven ground with soft patches interspersed with rocks and tree roots made reading tracks nearly impossible, blurring the line between new signs and pre-existing ones. Deputies noted there was no indication the four had returned to the campsite or headed back toward the station wagon. If they had, the dogs would have reacquired the scent on the old route, but they did not. This further reinforced the feeling that the story had been severed at precisely this point, as though a page had been torn from the ledger of reality. Carter, who had seen many searches end in disappointment, began to realize they were facing an investigative paradox. The most reliable tools had led to an unfillable void, and it was that very void that was most troubling, because it offered no reasonable next direction. In brief exchanges among the deputies, tentative hypotheses began to emerge, from the possibility that the four had left the area by another vehicle, to the possibility they had entered terrain that quickly erased traces. But each hypothesis stumbled on the same question: if that were true, why no intermediate signs, no debris, no slip marks, no evidence of a sudden change in movement? Carter tried to keep the search from being swept into baseless speculation, but he could not deny that the tracking results had pushed the case off its familiar track. In most cases, a trail leads to a clear outcome, either finding the missing persons, or at least determining their direction. Here, everything halted in a state of suspension. The lack of signs of return or continuation was not merely a technical failure, it was a blow to investigative logic, forcing Carter to consider possibilities he was not yet ready to name. Possibilities that went beyond the script of a routine forest trip gone wrong. By the end of the day, as the dogs were pulled back and the search team paused to reassess, the atmosphere around the point of loss grew heavy. Not because there was evidence of the worst outcome, but because of the complete absence of evidence, a silence offering no direction at all. Carter recorded the tracking results in the file with the dry precision of a veteran, but in his mind he understood that from this point forward, the investigation had entered a different phase, one where progress was no longer guaranteed by familiar logic, and where questions began to outnumber answers, not because they hadn't searched thoroughly enough, but because what they found seemed deliberately determined not to lead them any further. After every tracking effort ended at the same unexplainable void, Sheriff William H. Carter was forced to change his approach, shifting focus from searching space to reconstructing time. If they could not know where the four had gone, they could at least try to understand what had happened during the night they vanished. The first step in this process was a more detailed cross-referencing of weather data, than the initial cursory reports. Regional meteorological records were gathered, not only from the station near town, but also from auxiliary measurement points around the forest, revealing a sudden shift that evening. Temperatures dropped faster than forecast, humidity rose sharply, and fog formed early and unusually thick in low-lying areas, especially ravines and lower forest slopes, where visibility could drop to just a few meters for short periods. For those familiar with the terrain, fog of this kind not only causes disorientation, but also distorts sound. Distant noises seem close, and vice versa, a detail Carter carefully noted, as it could explain why any unusual sounds or signs, if present, might not have been correctly identified at the time. Alongside weather data, Carter ordered a compilation of all witness statements, not just those who proactively contacted police, but also people living or working near the forest that night, in order to construct an auditory and activity picture of the area during the critical time window. Most statements were vague, as the night had featured no standout events memorable enough for clear recall. Yet Carter hoped to find an intersection within those seemingly unimportant details. Some mentioned fog arriving earlier than usual, others noted feeling unusually cold when stepping outside in the evening. No one, however, reported seeing the four young people or their vehicle moving after dark, reinforcing the assumption that the group had entered the forest before weather conditions deteriorated noticeably. Among the statements, one stood out more than the others, coming from a farmer living on the edge of the search area. He reported that late in the night, he heard metallic sounds coming from the direction of the forest, not continuous, but clear enough to draw his attention, like metal striking stone, or being dragged across a hard surface. Though he could not pinpoint the exact direction or distance, the fact that these sounds occurred within the same time frame as the group's disappearance made them impossible to ignore. Carter recorded this report with the necessary caution, knowing that nighttime forest sounds can be amplified or misinterpreted, especially when combined with fog and damp air, but he also did not rule out the possibility that this was a rare proactive fragment, an indication that some unusual activity had occurred during that period. Reconstructing the night of disappearance did not stop at what was heard, but extended to what was indirectly recorded through communication devices. During the review, another detail was added to the file, a reported static call from a public payphone, located not far from the forest area. The night attendant recalled a brief call, lasting only a few seconds, before the line cut off abruptly, leaving a string of unclear interference noise. At the time, the call had not been considered significant, as line troubles were not uncommon in bad weather. But placed in the context of an unsolved disappearance, Carter could not help considering the possibility that this was a failed communication attempt, even without direct evidence linking it to the four. Deputies were assigned to verify the timing and location of the call, cross-referencing it with other reports. The results only confirmed that the call occurred within the reconstructed time frame, without yielding any additional specific clues. Meanwhile, continued sweeps around the point of scent loss produced small finds. One was a crumpled piece of paper discovered not far from the campsite, muddied and damp with leaves, on which the short handwritten phrase, "South Path," was still legible, though most of any other content, if it had existed, had been blurred by water and time. This scrap of paper immediately drew Carter's attention, not because it explained anything on its own, but because it suggested a direction or destination not recorded on the official maps the search team was using. Cross-checking the note against topographic maps yielded no clear result. No officially marked trail bore that name, and local residents questioned, gave inconsistent answers. Some said it might be an unofficial local name for an old path. Others said they had never heard of it. Carter entered the scrap into the file as a detail to be followed up, but he also understood that, like the metallic sounds or the static call. It was merely a standalone piece of information, not yet connectable into a complete logical chain. When the collected data were placed side by side, the picture of the night of disappearance emerged in a fragmented and unstable form: bad weather, thick fog, indistinct sounds, a failed communication attempt, and a scrap of paper suggesting a vague direction. Together they formed an uneven collection of clues, enough to indicate that something had not gone according to the original plan, but not enough to pinpoint the exact nature of the incident. Carter realized that reconstructing the night of disappearance was not about finding a single catastrophic moment, but about accepting that multiple overlapping factors may have been at play, each individually insufficiently strong, yet collectively pushing the four into a situation beyond their control. Nevertheless, as the person primarily responsible, he could not draw conclusions based on feeling or speculation. Therefore, everything gathered during this phase was recorded in detail but neutrally, as puzzle pieces still waiting for a larger context in which to find meaning. When night fell once more, and the search team paused operations to reassess, Carter looked at the steadily thickening file, and understood that although they had advanced further in terms of information compared to the early days, they still stood before the same unanswered question. Reconstructing the night of disappearance, rather than resolving the ambiguity, only made more prominent the gap between what could be inferred and what could be proven, a gap that at that point none of them yet knew how to bridge. From the scattered fragments of the vanishing night, the investigation moved into an expanded phase with an intensity that even Sheriff William H. Carter had not anticipated when he first received the report. With no specific trail left to follow, the only option remaining was to blanket the space with people and time, hoping that somewhere within the vast expanse of the forest and surrounding areas, a detail clear enough would emerge to break the deadlock. Search teams were reinforced, not only from the sheriff's department, but also from park rangers, local volunteers, and those familiar with the terrain. They scoured every trail, every ravine, every clearing, and even the rarely visited areas, working from early morning until the light was no longer sufficient to distinguish the ground beneath their feet. The days passed with the same exhausting rhythm. Each morning began with fresh hope and ended in familiar silence. Despite expanding the search in every reasonable direction, no new sign appeared to bring them any closer to the four missing people. End-of-day reports repeated the same conclusion: no additional items discovered, no signs of human activity found, no clues indicating where they had gone after the last point of contact. This very repetition gradually eroded confidence that expanding the scope would yield different results. The absence of bodies became a factor that offered both fragile hope and greater difficulty in classification. In investigative logic, no bodies meant the worst outcome could not be confirmed, yet it also provided no physical basis for building a criminal case, leaving all serious hypotheses resting on speculation. Carter was well aware that continuing to mobilize large-scale resources for an extended period without concrete progress would strain the county's resources and, more importantly, could erode community cooperation as people began to feel the search had exceeded its reasonable chance of success. In internal meetings, difficult questions began to arise, not about whether to continue, but about how to continue in a way that still maintained professional reasonableness. Every plausible area had already been checked at least once, and revisiting the same old routes only heightened the sense of marking time. The lack of an identified suspect further complicated matters. There were no signs of struggle at the campsite, no witnesses reporting strangers, no reports of suspicious vehicles in the area at the time, all of which made third-party involvement a hypothesis without clear support. Carter was careful to avoid any statement that might steer public opinion toward a criminal angle, understanding that in the absence of evidence, labeling the case could cause long-term consequences, from damaging the reputation of innocent people to creating misplaced pressure on the investigation. At the same time, he could not declare it merely an accident, because while the terrain was complex, it was not sufficient to explain the complete disappearance of 4 people without corresponding traces. This very hesitation reflected the state of the file, caught between 2 possibilities, but lacking enough evidence to fully commit to either. The investigative tools of that era quickly revealed their limitations: no electronic tracking, no centralized databases, and trace analysis relying far more on personal experience than technology, requiring every conclusion to be made with a high degree of caution. Carter noted in his report that although there were unusual details, the metallic sound, the static phone call, and the South Path scrap of paper, none of them, individually or in combination, reached the threshold necessary to establish a criminal element, and therefore could not serve as grounds for officially opening a criminal case. This decision was not made abruptly, but was the result of many days of weighing the responsibility to keep searching against the reality that every feasible investigative avenue had already been pursued to the extent possible. Prolonging full mobilization without progress would only create additional strain without delivering answers. When the decision to close active search operations was made, it was presented as a temporary suspension rather than an absolute end. The file was fully archived, reports carefully organized, and unexplained leads clearly noted for potential future review should new information arise. However, for those directly involved, freezing the case carried far heavier meaning than administrative language. It marked the moment when official silence was accepted as part of reality. No more daily status calls, no more search teams spreading through the forest, no more urgent decisions to be made before nightfall. Carter signed the final decision with a sense of incompleteness. While he could demonstrate that every step had been reasonable in the context of the time, he also understood that questions had been left unanswered, and those very questions would remain in the file, as voids that procedure could never fill. From this point onward, the case entered a frozen state, not because it had been solved, but because it had reached the limit of what could be done. In 1964, leaving 4 names on the missing persons list, and a thick file placed on the archive shelf, where it would rest quietly alongside the fragile hope that someday something might change enough to force it open once more. The long silence that followed the case being frozen at the end of 1964 seemed to have swallowed every possibility of an answer, until many decades later, it was broken by a detail so small that without very specific conditions, it might never have been noticed. An unusually heavy rainstorm swept through the southern forest area of the county, eroding the thin soil layer on a low slope, previously considered unremarkable, exposing dark metal fragments that lay in a pattern not consistent with the natural arrangement of rocks or tree roots, but rather like the remnants of a long-buried artificial structure. The first person to notice this was not police or rangers, but a local resident familiar with the terrain. Having passed through the area many times over the years, he knew that nothing like this had ever emerged from the ground at this spot before. This difference made him pause longer, brush away the fresh mud washed down by the water, and realize that what had been revealed was not random scrap iron, but a clearly edged metal surface, lying at a depth inconsistent with ordinary trash or debris. The initial report sent to authorities was exploratory in nature, containing no speculation, only a description of the location, condition, and the fact that this metal had not appeared before. While in normal circumstances such information might have been handled merely as an environmental or safety issue, its emergence in an area previously linked to an unsolved missing persons case caused it to be immediately forwarded to higher authority for evaluation. When the initial response team approached the scene, they conducted a preliminary inspection with appropriate caution, cordoning off a small area around the exposed point, measuring relative depth, and determining that this metal was not an isolated object, but only a portion of a larger structure still buried underground. The edges and surfaces showed signs of prolonged corrosion, suggesting it had been buried for many decades. Examination did not proceed further at this stage, not due to lack of interest, but because protocol required clear identification of the find's nature before expanding intervention, especially in an area once connected to a sensitive old case. It was here that a decisive shift occurred. An archives officer noticed that the discovery location matched remarkably with the search perimeter once recorded in a missing persons file from the 1960s. Upon preliminary cross-reference, case file #1956 was immediately cited, not as a sensational hypothesis, but as a possibility requiring serious verification. Although this file had rested quietly on the archive shelf for many years, it still contained enough information to show a similarity in location. This coincidence forced those involved to view the new discovery through an entirely different lens, not as an anonymous object, but as a potential lead related to an unsolved case. The decision to directly link the current find with case file #1956 was not made hastily, but through a series of cross-checks to rule out error, from confirming exact coordinates to reviewing old notes on previously searched areas. When the data were placed side by side, the degree of correspondence was significant enough to exceed random chance. From that moment, the question was no longer whether the discovery was related, but how deeply it was related, and whether it carried sufficient weight to break the decades-long frozen status of the file. Internal discussions took place with a high degree of discretion, since any move could trigger unwanted legal and media consequences if the discovery ultimately proved fruitless, but ignoring it would also mean accepting that a rare opportunity had been wasted. After weighing these factors, approval was granted to examine the site in greater depth, not as an official declaration of reopening the case, but as a necessary verification step to determine whether there was sufficient basis to proceed further. Initial observations showed that the buried metal had a shape and size inconsistent with natural formations or small scattered objects, and the arrangement of the overlying soil layers indicated human intervention at some point in the past, further increasing the likelihood that the discovery was not accidental. When the preliminary report was completed and sent to the appropriate authority, the direct reference to case file #1956 in the official document marked a significant turning point. For the first time in many decades, the file was mentioned not in the context of storage or reminiscence, but as a case with the potential to be reactivated based on new physical evidence. The decision to reopen the file was not publicly announced immediately, but administratively it had occurred. Old documents were retrieved from storage, seals were rechecked, and the case status was changed from frozen to under review. A small change on paper, but one of great significance for what might follow. At this point, no conclusions had been drawn, no hypotheses confirmed, and no promises made that the truth would finally be revealed. But the appearance of metal beneath the soil after the rain accomplished what decades of waiting could not. It forced the system to look again at an old case with fresh eyes, and to accept that what was once considered unsolvable might still be there, waiting for the right moment to be rediscovered. From the moment the buried metal discovery was officially linked to case file #1956, all subsequent actions unfolded in a completely different rhythm. No longer tentative probes, but a deliberate sequence of decisions aimed at moving a file once considered to have reached its limit back into an active state. The decision to reopen the cold case was signed not in a noisy press conference, but in a brief internal meeting where the focus was not on emotion or public pressure, but on the question of whether the new physical evidence was strong enough to break through assumptions that had persisted for more than 6 decades. Once the file's status was updated in the system, re-accepting the entire archive became the top priority. No new approach could stand firm unless built upon the foundation of what had already been done, recorded, and left behind due to lack of tools or suitable context. The boxes retrieved from storage carried the marks of time, yellowed paper, fading ink, typewritten reports in old fonts, accompanied by handwritten notes from long-retired or deceased investigators. Reading them again was not merely a technical process, but an indirect dialogue with decisions made in an entirely different context. The team tasked with receiving the file had to spend time reconstructing the 1964 sequence of events in logical order. Many documents had been arranged by date of creation rather than investigative progression, making it difficult to properly understand the connections between clues without patience and discipline. During this process, details once considered secondary, such as vague phrasing in scene reports or marginal notes not included in official conclusions, were flagged for re-examination in light of the new discovery. Not to judge those who came before, but to understand the limitations they had faced. Forming a dedicated investigative team was the unavoidable next step. A case spanning more than 60 years could not be handled like an ordinary matter. This team was carefully assembled with expertise in cold cases, old crime scene analysis, modern forensics, and timeline reconstruction, ensuring every aspect of the case was viewed from an appropriate angle. From the outset, the team agreed that the goal was not to repeat what was done in 1964, but to clearly identify which questions could not be answered at the time, and determine whether current tools could address them. An approach requiring patience and willingness to accept that some assumptions once deemed reasonable might no longer hold. Defining the new investigative direction therefore became the focus of this phase, with a clear separation between contextual elements and those that could be re-verified, from geographic location and weather conditions to physical findings that were recorded but never deeply analyzed. The team decided to prioritize elements capable of producing material evidence or objective data, rather than starting with new witness statements, since time had altered human memory, while soil, metal, and buried structures tended to retain traces far longer. Reopening the file also triggered a series of administrative and legal requirements, from reconfirming the seals on old evidence to ensuring all new actions met modern standards, avoiding repetition of the limitations that had existed in the early phase. In the team's initial meetings, the atmosphere was realistic rather than optimistic. Everyone understood that reopening a cold case did not guarantee answers, and that the metal discovery, while significant, was only a starting point, not a conclusion. Yet, unlike 1964, when decisions were constrained by lack of tools and resource pressure, this time the team could afford to dig deeper into details once overlooked, not because they were deemed unimportant then, but because no convincing means of verification existed at the time. The decision to reopen the file was therefore not seen as a complete reversal of the past, but as a continuation, old questions asked again in a new context, with the hope that what was once considered a dead end might become clearer when viewed through the eyes of 2025. When this phase concluded, the file no longer rested quietly in storage. It became a living entity, updated, debated, and examined in every detail. Although no conclusion had yet been reached, reopening the cold case had created something the case had lacked for more than half a century, a real opportunity to move forward, built on the combination of what was already known and what was only now beginning to emerge. From the decision to reopen the case and the complete restructuring of all archived data, the next step followed an almost inevitable logic, returning to the very discovery point that had triggered the reinvestigation process. This time, instead of a preliminary check as before, the site was treated as a controlled excavation area, with clearly established boundaries, precisely positioned coordinates using modern equipment, and every operation recorded according to strict forensic protocols. The initial excavation was conducted cautiously, not with the goal of digging quickly or deeply, but to read the structure of the soil layers, determine whether the exposed metal fragments were the protruding part of a larger object, or merely scattered pieces, and most importantly, to assess whether the area had been disturbed by human activity in the past. Within just the first few hours, the earliest signs that this was not a randomly buried structure became clear. The overlying soil layers showed uneven disturbance, not following natural sedimentation patterns, suggesting the area had been dug up and then refilled at some point, a detail that immediately raised the site's priority level. Precise positioning of the discovery location was carried out in parallel, with coordinate markers cross-referenced against old topographic maps. It was during this process that the investigation team realized the excavation area lay right at the outer edge of the 1964 search perimeter, close enough that it could have been passed over, yet sufficiently offset to not have been the focus at the time. This coincidence was both troubling and explanatory for why it could have been overlooked for decades. As the next soil layer was removed, the first finds were not something anyone was prepared to face. Amid the corroded metal fragments, the excavation team began to recognize the unmistakable structures of human bone. At first only scattered fragments, not yet sufficient to determine form, but enough to shift the entire scene to full forensic status. That moment marked a fundamental change in the nature of the investigation. From this point forward, the case was no longer a missing persons file with open hypotheses, but an investigation involving death, with all the accompanying legal and procedural consequences. The excavation process was temporarily halted to re-establish protocols, ensuring that every bone fragment and every small detail was accurately recorded in terms of position, depth, and relationship to surrounding objects, in preparation for later scene reconstruction. Once the bone fragments were collected and preliminarily arranged, forensic experts gave their initial assessment. The remains had lain here for a very long time, consistent with the time frame of the 1964 disappearance, and showed no signs of having been dragged or completely disturbed by animals after burial. This reinforced the hypothesis that the location was not merely temporary, but could be directly related to the events leading to death. Preliminary identification was conducted with extreme caution, as in a decades-long case, any hasty conclusion could have serious consequences. However, factors such as estimated age from the bones, skeletal structure, and certain morphological characteristics were sufficient for the experts to conclude that the remains were very likely those of one of the young people who went missing in 1964. Further analyses were planned to compare against medical, dental, and remaining records of the victim group, but even before final confirmation, the connection to the group of four had become nearly undeniable, given the matching geographic and temporal context. Internal notification of this discovery was carried out strictly according to procedure, with careful consideration of the method and timing, because the investigation team understood that confirming the first set of remains was not only a procedural milestone, but also opened a new phase of the case, one where every step would face even stricter scrutiny, both legally and ethically. Once the initial data was compiled, a key decision was made to immediately expand the search area, not just around the discovery site, but in directions potentially related based on terrain structure and information already known from old files. If this was where part of the story had been buried, it was highly likely it did not stand alone. This expansion was not haphazard, but directed, with priority zones identified by combining modern maps with old notes, to avoid repeating the mistake of unfocused, scattered searches from the past. Throughout the process, the team maintained a difficult balance between speed and precision, as the pressure of having found the first remains could easily lead to rushed decisions, while this very case had already demonstrated the consequences of overlooking details in the pursuit of speed. When the first day of excavation concluded, the site was no longer an abstract point of suspicion, but a concrete space tied to the death of at least one member of the group of four missing persons. From that moment on, every previous hypothesis had to be re-evaluated in a new light, not for the sake of drama, but to answer a question that had hung unresolved for over 60 years: what really happened here, and why did it take so long for the first signs of truth to emerge? From the excavation site, where the first bone fragments were lifted from the layers of earth that had concealed them for decades, the focus of the investigation naturally shifted to the forensic laboratory, where what could not be spoken at the scene began to be interpreted through structure, density, and remaining traces on the skeletal remains. It was here for the first time that the vague assumptions lingering since 1964 confronted objective data. Bone analysis was conducted systematically, starting with determination of age, sex, and overall condition of the skeleton before delving into specific injuries. Right from the early stages, Experts noted that the bones showed no signs of the chaotic decomposition typically seen when a body is dragged by animals or heavily impacted by natural environmental forces over a long period. The bone surfaces were relatively intact, with no bite marks, no characteristic gnawing grooves from rodents, and no evidence of widespread scattering of the remains. This allowed early exclusion of the hypothesis that death and decomposition occurred entirely beyond human control in an uncontrolled wilderness environment. When the larger bones were reassembled according to anatomical structure, the injuries began to appear more clearly, not as complete shattering typical of free-fall accidents or major landslides, but as concentrated cracks and deformations, suggesting that the force had been applied in a confined space, with direction and intensity that did not change abruptly. These signs led the forensic team to question the timing of the injuries, as some fractures showed biological bone response, meaning they likely formed while the victim was still alive, or at least very close to the moment of death, rather than as a result of post-burial soil pressure. This detail opened the possibility that death was not instantaneous, but the result of a process prolonged enough for the body to react to both the injury and the surrounding environment. The search for signs of non-instantaneous death became the next focus, with tests designed to detect residual biochemical markers within the bone structure. The results went beyond what the investigation team had expected in a case more than 60 years old. The analysis revealed the presence of compounds related to hypoxia in the bone tissue, a rare but valuable finding, indicating that the victim had experienced a period of respiratory distress prior to death, rather than dying immediately from mechanical trauma. This discovery forced the forensic team to expand testing to identify the specific cause of the hypoxia, and it was here that the hypothesis of toxic gas exposure began to be taken seriously. Bone samples were analyzed more deeply for traces of carbon monoxide and related byproducts. Although most soft tissue was gone, indirect signs were sufficient to indicate that the victim had inhaled a significant amount of toxic gas in the time leading up to death. This not only explained the respiratory failure, but also fit the context of a confined or semi-confined space, where toxic gas could accumulate rapidly without dispersing. When cross-referenced with the terrain where the remains were found, the forensic and investigation teams realized that death by toxic gas was unlikely in an open forest environment, unless there was some structure or special condition that prevented the gas from escaping. An observation that shook the initial hypothesis of natural accident or death from exhaustion after getting lost. The systematic elimination of other possibilities began, starting with wild animals. If the victim had been attacked or died due to animal activity, the bones would bear highly characteristic marks, and as already recorded, those signs were completely absent. Natural accidents such as falls, landslides, or falling trees were also considered, but the observed injury pattern did not match a sudden high-energy event. It more closely resembled prolonged pressure or impact within a restricted environment, from which the victim could not quickly escape. The combination of bone injuries, signs of hypoxia, and indirect evidence of toxic gas forced the forensic team to establish a new hypothesis for cause of death, one not based on a single incident, but on a chain of overlapping conditions leading to death over a certain period. According to this hypothesis, the victim had been in a space where the air was contaminated by toxic gas sufficient to cause respiratory failure, while simultaneously suffering physical impacts that did not kill immediately, but weakened the ability to self-rescue, and it was this combination that led to death. Importantly, this hypothesis did not require the immediate presence of direct violent action, but neither did it rule out the possibility of human intervention in creating or maintaining those dangerous conditions. Establishing the forensic hypothesis was not seen as a final conclusion, but as a temporary explanatory framework, solid enough to guide the next investigative steps, yet still open to adjustment with new evidence. For the investigation team, this was the first time they held a scientifically based model of cause of death, rather than speculation, and that completely changed their perspective on the case. It proved that what had happened could not be explained by a simple forest accident, nor by voluntary disappearance, but by a far more complex chain of events that had occurred under specific conditions which until now were only beginning to be revealed. From the forensic hypothesis of a confined space and the presence of toxic gas, the investigation team was forced to return to the scene with a new foundational question: if death could not have occurred in an open forest environment, then what structure had created those conditions? And it was during the expanded excavation in the directions determined by stratigraphic data that they reached a discovery that caused the entire prior logic to pause and be reconsidered from the beginning. Beneath the compacted soil and rubble, at a depth inconsistent with natural structures in the area, experts began to uncover larger, more coherent metal panels with straight edges and curved surfaces, clearly indicating that this was not debris from small agricultural machinery or accumulated waste over time, but the body of a motorized vehicle. As the soil continued to be carefully peeled away, the shape of a utility vehicle gradually emerged, buried at an angle as though it had been pushed or slid into position, and then covered with earth, a sight completely incompatible with any natural accident scenario previously considered. The discovery of a county-owned utility vehicle buried right in the area directly linked to the 1964 disappearance immediately created a turning point. There was no reasonable explanation for a government agency vehicle to be present here without any official record or documentation. Vehicle identification proceeded in parallel with scene preservation, beginning with controlled cleaning of metal surfaces to search for identifying marks. Although time had obscured many details, remaining paint fragments, body style and technical characteristics were sufficient for experts to determine that this was a utility vehicle under county management, manufactured and placed into service before 1964. Cross-checking the VIN and other technical identifiers against archived records showed that this vehicle had once been logged in the system, but was later marked as missing or irreparably damaged, a detail that only heightened the abnormality of its presence at this scene. When the vehicle interior was accessed, the next discovery made the atmosphere at the site noticeably heavier inside. Beyond traces of corrosion and soil were items unmistakably belonging not to utility vehicle equipment, but to the young people who disappeared in 1964. Personal items found in the vehicle, from small personal belongings to camping gear, created a direct and undeniable link between this buried vehicle and the victim group, a connection that had not previously existed in any hypothesis. The presence of victims' belongings inside a vehicle unrelated to them in terms of ownership raised a serious temporal contradiction. If this vehicle had been decommissioned or reported missing after 1964, how could those items be inside it? Conversely, if they had been placed there at the time of the group's disappearance, why was there no record whatsoever of this county utility vehicle operating in that area during the corresponding period? Investigators began to realize they were facing a paradox that could not be resolved by simply rearranging old hypotheses. It demanded an entirely new perspective on the sequence of events. The spatial coincidence combined with temporal contradiction shattered the assumption that everything had occurred within a single time frame and followed a linear progression. Evaluating the significance of this evidence therefore could not stop at merely acknowledging the vehicle's existence. It required examining its role in the overall picture, from the possibility that it had once been part of a larger structure, to the likelihood that it had itself created the confined space necessary to explain the forensic findings regarding toxic gas. Scene specialists noted that the vehicle's position and burial attitude showed it had not been gradually covered by natural erosion over time, but bore signs of intentional placement, with the overlying soil compacted unevenly, suggesting human intervention after the vehicle ceased operation. The temporal contradiction became even clearer when the data were placed side by side. The disappearance occurred in 1964, The vehicle was logged in county records prior to that, and burial signs indicated at least one intervention afterward, a sequence of events impossible to explain if everything had happened simultaneously. For the investigation team, what was disturbing was not only the existence of the county utility vehicle, but the implication that some activity related to infrastructure or maintenance must have occurred in this area, enough to bring a large vehicle into the forest, and then vanished from all official records. The evidence evaluation was thus elevated to a new level. It no longer revolved solely around what happened to the 4 people. It expanded to who had the ability to access this area with the necessary vehicle and equipment, and why that activity left no corresponding administrative trace. At this point, the buried county utility vehicle was no longer just a shocking find. It had become the central knot where hypotheses about confined space, toxic gas, non-instantaneous injuries, and the group's disappearance began to intersect in a manner that was both terrifying and logical. And it was precisely its presence here and at this moment that provided the clearest evidence that there were elements in this case no one had ever imagined existed, until the earth was dug deep enough. From the moment the official vehicle being buried was confirmed as something that should not have existed at this scene, the focus of the investigation completely shifted to one key question: if that vehicle wasn't simply abandoned, but had been deliberately buried, then someone had returned to the site after the initial event to tamper with the scene, and traces of that action must still remain within the soil structure. Stratigraphy experts were brought in to analyze the soil layers covering the area, not just to determine depth and continuity, but to read the history of ground disturbance as a sequence of events recorded in sediment. Right from the first samples, the difference between soil layers became clear, with an irregular boundary showing that the upper layer had not been deposited naturally over time, but had been dug up and then backfilled, creating a mixture of soil particles with varying moisture and composition, a classic sign of reburial. Deeper layers displayed more stable structure, consistent with natural accumulation over many years, while the overlying cover exhibited characteristics of relatively recent disturbance, with unevenly compacted patches and the presence of materials not belonging to the same geological stratum. This analysis not only confirmed that the scene had been tampered with, but also showed that the intervention occurred after the large objects, including the official vehicle and the remains, were already in their current positions. Since the soil layers surrounding them showed signs of being disrupted and then rearranged, the evidence of post-event disturbance became even clearer when analysts compared the soil compaction in adjacent undisturbed areas with the burial area, and this difference could not be explained by natural erosion or landslides, especially given the terrain lacked sufficient slope to produce such movement. During the expanded excavation, other physical traces also began to emerge, not as major clues, but as small details such as elongated compression marks running in a specific direction, suggesting the use of tools or machinery to backfill the soil, rather than just hands or letting nature take its course. It was in one of these soil layers that shoe prints began to be identified, initially only as faint shapes in the damp soil, but when clarified using casting techniques, they revealed a clear sole pattern that did not match any footwear identified as belonging to the victims. Cross-referencing this shoe print with available data showed it belonged to a common type of work boot from the 1960s, with a thick sole and distinctive tread pattern, typically used in maintenance or construction work, a seemingly minor detail with major significance, because it indicated that the person who left this trace was likely not one of the 4 missing young people, but someone else who appeared at the scene after they disappeared. The shoe prints did not appear randomly or scattered, but were concentrated around the burial area, following a logical movement path, suggesting that the wearer had moved with purpose, possibly during digging, arranging or backfilling, and then left the area along a specific route. Estimating the time of the reburial became the next step, and this is where modern science began to fill the gaps that the 1964 investigation could not reach. Through isotope analysis, decay rates of organic material in the soil, and oxidation levels on buried metal surfaces. Preliminary results showed that the reburied soil layer could not have the same age as the initial disappearance, but was significantly younger, consistent with an intervention that occurred several years later, long enough for the original scene to have been forgotten, but not long enough for all traces to have been completely erased. Although this estimated time frame has not yet been pinpointed to the exact year, it significantly narrowed the window of intervention, ruling out the possibility that the burial was part of the 1964 event, and instead indicating that there was at least one return to the scene with clear intent. The conclusion of human intervention is therefore no longer speculation, but a finding supported by the convergence of multiple independent pieces of evidence: disrupted soil structure, shoe prints not matching the victims, the arrangement of large objects, and chronological inconsistencies recorded in the files. For the investigative team, this carried implications far deeper than merely confirming the scene had been altered. It proved that after the 4 people went missing and possibly died, someone knew enough to return, had the ability to access the area with suitable tools, and chose to cover it up rather than report it, a deliberate decision with consequences that stretched across decades. The existence of the reburial action forces the entire case to be re-examined under a new lens, where the question is no longer just what happened on the night in 1964, but also what happened afterward, who was involved, and why they believed intervening in the scene was necessary. When the analysis reports were completed, they were entered into the case file as structural evidence, not shocking like the discovery of remains or a buried vehicle, but carrying long-term weight, because they shifted the case from the status of an unsolved tragedy to a sequence of events involving human participation at multiple different points in time. At this stage, confirming the reburial evidence did not immediately lead to names or motives, but it drew a clear line between accident and action, between incident and decision, and it is that very line that would shape every subsequent investigative step, because from this point forward, it could no longer be said that what happened was merely the result of circumstances and weather. It had to be acknowledged that human hands had intervened, leaving traces that could not be erased in the earth and in the history of the case. From the undeniable evidence of reburial and the scientifically established signs of human intervention through stratigraphy, the investigative team was compelled to return to the starting point of the case with an entirely different attitude, not the routine respect for old files, but a deliberate rereading aimed at identifying what was recorded, what was misinterpreted, and what may have been overlooked within the professional context of 1964. The review of old investigation reports was conducted systematically. Every scene log, every witness statement transcript, every search diagram was repositioned within the sequence of events, not to assign blame to predecessors, but to understand the logic that led them to close the case at the time. Upon rereading the initial reports, the team noticed a consistent theme running through them. Every assessment revolved around the assumption that the victims had left the campsite on foot and vanished into the open forest environment, an assumption reasonable at the time, but now rendered incompatible when compared with the discoveries of an enclosed space, toxic gas, and buried vehicle. The 1964 search maps showed rapid but shallow expansion, prioritizing trails and easily accessible areas, while zones considered old infrastructure or rarely used were not evaluated as potential risk spaces, a reflection of the era's common approach, where natural accidents were regarded as the default explanation for outdoor disappearances. When comparing the old file with new findings, the discrepancy between assumption and reality became evident, as details once considered anomalous but insufficient to change the direction of investigation, now fit together in ways that 1964 could not have seen, from reports of metallic sounds at night, to the absence of footprints leaving the campsite, and especially the presence of the South Path scrap of paper, which at the time was not placed in a sufficiently specific topographic context. Identifying procedural shortcomings was not understood as personal fault, but as the result of limitations in tools, data, and the thinking of the era, when there was no capability to detect buried structures underground, no methods for analyzing toxic gases on decomposed remains, and no way to quickly cross-reference records of missing official vehicles. One of the most notable points when rereading the file was how the South Path scrap of paper was handled. It was properly noted, collected and archived according to procedure, yet treated as a vague note lacking directional value because no detailed map at the time clearly identified a route or area by that name. In the current investigation context, the team realized that South Path did not necessarily have to be an official or marked road, but could refer to an old infrastructure access route, a maintenance service line, or a familiar direction of movement for those who had worked in the area, something 1964 did not consider because their focus was on public trails. Re-evaluating this clue led to comparisons with technical maps and old county infrastructure records, and although no conclusion has been reached at this stage, the alignment in direction and location between South Path and the area where the buried vehicle was found is sufficient to affirm that this scrap of paper was undervalued in the original context. Old reports also showed that the lack of signs of struggle or violence led investigators at the time to rule out criminal activity early on, a understandable decision, but now re-examined in light of evidence showing post-event intervention, because the absence of direct violence at the initial scene does not mean there was no subsequent cover-up action. When rereading the procedural decisions recorded in the file, the team noticed that several choices had been made to protect resources and avoid unsubstantiated speculation, but in the new context, those very choices now reveal how the case was prematurely framed, within certain assumptions, causing clues that did not fit that frame to be left unpursued. Comparing the old file with new discoveries is not intended to rewrite investigative history, but to reposition details within a new logical structure, where metallic sounds are no longer random environmental phenomena, the South Path scrap is no longer an aimless note, and the absence of footprints is no longer puzzling, but a logical consequence of the victims not leaving via open paths. When the review process concluded, the 1964 file was not deemed mistaken, but regarded as a faithful record of what was possible at the time, with clear limitations, and precisely understanding those limitations helps the current investigative team avoid repeating similar errors when facing new assumptions. Rereading the old file in the present context is therefore not merely an administrative exercise, but an essential investigative step, allowing the connection of past and present into a continuous sequence, where questions once left hanging are no longer adrift, but anchored by physical, scientific and logical evidence, creating a foundation for subsequent steps to be based not on assumptions, but on a deeper understanding of what happened and what was concealed for more than 6 decades. From the rereading of the 1964 file in light of the new discoveries, especially the reburial evidence and the presence of the buried official vehicle, the direction of the investigation could no longer remain broad. It had to be systematically narrowed to individuals who had the ability to access the area during key time periods. It was here that compiling a list of everyone who had entered or exited the area became the foundational step for the entire modern investigative phase. The team began by identifying every individual, direct or indirect, who had legal right or legitimate reason to be present in the southern forest area of the county around 1964, and in the years that followed, including not only law enforcement and park rangers, but also extending to infrastructure maintenance crews, seasonal workers, subcontractors, and individuals assigned to tasks related to roads, drainage, or official vehicles. This list was not built on personal memory or hearsay, but constructed from preserved administrative records, work assignment logs, payroll records, and financial documents showing who was paid to work in the area, or was involved in operating official vehicles at the relevant times. When the initial list was formed, it proved longer than anticipated, reflecting the reality that over many decades this area had been used or passed through by numerous departments, but that very length allowed the team to begin systematic elimination based on specific criteria, rather than guesswork. The county maintenance records became the most important data source in this phase, as they not only recorded who worked where, but also indicated what type of vehicle was used, at what time, and for what purpose, creating an administrative picture that no one had previously connected to the 1964 disappearance. As these records were digitized and cross-referenced, several anomalies began to emerge, not as direct evidence, but as gaps, vague notes, and blank entries precisely during the period when reburial evidence indicated intervention had occurred. Cross-referencing work schedules became a sharp tool for narrowing the scope, as the team compared each individual's timeline against the estimated window of the initial event and the reburial period, eliminating those who were not present in the county, did not work in the area, or lacked access to the necessary vehicles and tools. This process proceeded slowly but steadily, with each elimination based on verified data, and the suspect list gradually shrank from dozens to just a few names that matched all the criteria: presence in the area, access to or ability to use official vehicles, and schedules aligning with the post-event intervention period. It was during this process that one suspect gradually stood out, not because of a single decisive piece of evidence, but due to the convergence of many small factors that, when placed together, formed a noteworthy picture. This individual's file showed direct involvement in infrastructure maintenance activities in the area during the sensitive time frame, along with connection to the management or operation of vehicles of the same type as the buried official vehicle, and more notably, periods of work that were not fully documented, with generic notes that did not specify exact locations. As the team dug deeper into the personal file, they realized that this person was not only present during the disappearance period, but continued working in the county in subsequent years, coinciding precisely with the time frame that stratigraphic analysis indicated the scene had been reburied, an overlap that could not be ignored. However, the investigative team maintained necessary caution, avoiding letting this prominence lead to confirmation bias, and continued cross-referencing this suspect's data with the remaining individuals on the list, to ensure all conclusions were based on comprehensive comparison rather than initial impression. The narrowing of the investigation was therefore not carried out by mass elimination, but by tightening the criteria, with each filtering round clarifying the profile of anyone potentially involved while ruling out cases that did not fully meet the necessary conditions. During this process, the team also considered additional factors such as familiarity with the terrain, the ability to work independently without close supervision, and access to rarely visited areas, factors not clearly shown in paper records, but inferable from the nature of the job and the context of the era. Gradually, the scope of investigation shrank to a manageable level, no longer an anonymous long list, but a very small group of individuals capable of meeting all the necessary conditions to both be present at the initial scene and return later to intervene. Within this group, the prominent suspect was no longer just a name on paper, but an individual requiring deeper examination through direct investigative measures. At this stage, narrowing down suspects did not mean identifying the perpetrator, but marked an important shift from scene-based and physical evidence investigation to a person-focused investigation, where each subsequent decision would have to balance objective data with individual rights, the need to uncover truth with the obligation to follow legal procedure. When this phase concluded, the investigative team entered a stage where every clue, no matter how small, had to be considered in the context of a very limited number of specific names, and it was precisely this narrowing that created a new kind of pressure, no longer stemming from the vagueness of an unsolved case, but from the responsibility to prove, with irrefutable evidence, whether that prominent suspect was truly the key link in the chain of events that had been buried for more than 60 years. From the moment the scope of suspects was narrowed down to a minimum involving a single prominent individual who fully met the criteria of access, opportunity, and context, the investigation entered its most critical phase, where every inference had to be transformed into specific, verifiable, cross-checkable evidence, and most importantly, evidence capable of withstanding the rigorous standard of proof required by the modern justice system. The investigative team was fully aware that in a case spanning more than 6 decades, a sense of reasonableness or logic alone was entirely insufficient, as any gap in the chain of evidence could be exploited to undermine the entire case. Therefore, the collection and strengthening of evidence could not rely on intuition, but had to be based on repeatable, independent, and verifiable processes. The first priority was the collection of DNA, not only to confirm the identity of the already recovered victims, but more importantly, to search for biological traces of other individuals at the scene, especially within the confined space created by the buried service vehicle. Samples were taken from multiple sources, including the metal surfaces inside the vehicle compartment, soil layers in direct contact with the remains, personal items of the victims trapped within the vehicle structure, and areas showing signs of repeated contact such as door handles, door frames, and recessed corners minimally affected by natural environmental degradation. Although the team had mentally prepared for the possibility of obtaining no results due to the extremely long passage of time, next-generation DNA analysis techniques allowed the extraction and amplification of extremely small amounts of genetic material. This produced a major breakthrough when several samples revealed the presence of DNA that did not match any of the 4 victims. These results were neither announced nor interpreted hastily. Instead, they were sent to a second independent laboratory for cross-verification to rule out any possibility of contamination or processing error. When the results were confirmed to match, the investigative team possessed biological evidence demonstrating the presence of another individual at the scene during the critical time frame. In parallel with DNA, footwear impression analysis became another crucial pillar of evidence. Footprints not only indicated someone's presence at the scene, but also allowed inferences about the individual's type of work, movement habits, and occupational connections. Casts were made from the impressions in the reburied soil layer and subjected to detailed analysis. Every parameter, sole pattern, degree of wear, length, width, and angle of ground contact was measured and compared against historical databases of work boots commonly used in the 1960s. The results showed that the impressions matched a line of safety boots widely used in infrastructure maintenance and public works, footwear not commonly worn by young civilians, but very familiar to those employed by the county or its subcontractors. More importantly, the size and wear characteristics of the soles indicated long-term use of the same pair, consistent with a regular laborer, rather than someone who appeared only by chance. When this data was cross-referenced with employment records, the investigative team began building a solid bridge between the physical crime scene and a specific individual by reviewing work histories, task assignments, and vehicle access authorizations of the prominent suspect. Shift schedules, payroll records, and vehicle deployment logs, previously regarded as dry administrative data, now became highly valuable indirect evidence. They demonstrated that the suspect not only worked in the area at the time of the 1964 disappearances, but also continued participating in maintenance activities in subsequent years, aligning with the time frame of the reburial as determined by stratigraphic analysis. Particularly, unusual gaps in the records, where no specific notes about work location or assigned tasks existed, could no longer be dismissed simply as filing errors, as they precisely coincided with periods when the scene showed signs of human intervention. The investigative team spent considerable time cross-checking every small detail, from the types of vehicles the suspect was authorized to use to the maintenance routes he regularly traveled. in order to determine whether a reasonable path existed from daily work duties to the crime scene location without attracting attention. The strength of the evidence was evaluated with the direct participation of prosecutors, as the goal was not merely to build a robust investigative hypothesis, but to construct a prosecutable case capable of withstanding fierce defense challenges. Each piece of evidence was weighed with the core question: could it be explained by a reasonable innocent scenario? If so, what additional elements were needed to rule out that possibility? DNA showed presence but did not automatically prove conduct. Footprints showed action but required context to tie to timing. Employment records showed opportunity but had to be placed within a specific chain of events to become incriminating evidence. It was the tight integration of these three elements that created a sufficiently strong evidentiary structure, where each component did not stand alone but reinforced the others. In the final review sessions, the investigative team repeatedly returned to the question of the standard of proof, understanding that this case, due to its historical nature, would face exceptionally intense scrutiny, not only from the legal system, but also from the public. Preparing for arrest was therefore not seen as the end of the investigation phase, but as the beginning of a new phase, where even the smallest error could be magnified and undermine confidence in the entire process. Documents were reorganized into a clear logical sequence, from crime scene forensic evidence, stratigraphy, to employment records, and trace analysis, to ensure that when the moment for action arrived, every decision rested on a solid foundation and could be explained coherently. When the evidence collection and consolidation phase concluded, the investigative team no longer faced a vague case built on speculation, but a thick file dense with data, where every page was tied to a calculated step. The decision to prepare for arrest was no longer a gamble, but the inevitable result of an investigation guided by evidence, patience, and absolute respect for the standards of justice. From the moment the evidentiary file was completed at a level sufficient to meet prosecution standards, the decision to issue an arrest warrant was no longer a question of if, but when. That moment arrived after a series of final reviews to ensure every procedure was carried out with absolute precision, because in a case spanning more than 60 years, any small mistake at this stage could cause the entire investigative effort to collapse. The arrest warrant was drafted based on a dense summary of evidence, in which each key element was tightly linked, from biological evidence, footwear impressions, employment records, to forensic and stratigraphic conclusions, to demonstrate that depriving the suspect of liberty was not a hasty action, but the inevitable outcome of a prolonged and cautious investigation. Once the warrant was approved, information was kept within the minimum necessary circle, not to create dramatic secrecy, but to ensure the safety of the executing officers, and to prevent any possibility of tampering with remaining evidence or provoking unpredictable reactions from the suspect. The arrest operation was planned in detail, based on verified daily routines, current residence, and relevant security factors, with the goal of completing the task quickly, controllably, and without endangering the surrounding community. When the team approached the suspect, the situation unfolded exactly as anticipated: no resistance, no outward drama, just a heavy silent moment, when one person had to confront the consequences of actions buried for so long that he might have believed they would remain buried forever. The suspect was informed of the arrest warrant and his rights in strict accordance with procedure. Every word was read clearly, not for formality, but because in a case of this nature, procedural accuracy carried as much weight as the substance of the charges themselves. Simultaneously with detaining the suspect, authorities conducted searches for related evidence at the residence and previously identified locations, not for sensational discoveries, but to preserve any documents, items, or traces that could further strengthen or clarify the reconstructed chain of events. Every item of evidence was sealed, documented, and transferred according to the chain of custody, because the investigative team understood that at this stage, maintaining evidentiary integrity was more important than any new finding. Internal notification of the arrest was carried out immediately afterward within a tightly controlled scope, ensuring that all relevant units were fully aware of the case's new status, while preparing for the legal and administrative requirements arising as the case moved from investigation to prosecution. There was no hasty public statement, no immediate press release, because the top priority at that moment was to ensure that every subsequent step rested on a solid legal foundation and avoided creating public pressure that could influence later proceedings. The case file was officially transitioned from active investigation to prosecution preparation, a technical shift with profound symbolic meaning, as it marked the first time since 1964 that the matter was no longer frozen in a state of open questions, but advanced toward a point where individual accountability would begin to be determined. For the investigative team, this moment brought no sense of triumph, but rather the weight of responsibility. They understood that the arrest was only the beginning of another process, where every conclusion would have to be proven in court under the intense scrutiny of both the law and the public. When the suspect was taken away, and the door closed behind him, there were no cheers, no complete sense of relief, only the familiar silence that had enveloped the case for decades. But this time that silence carried a different meaning, no longer a sign of impasse, but the quiet before the truth is placed on the scales of justice. From the moment the suspect was arrested, and the file officially moved to the prosecution phase, the focus of the case shifted to the interrogation room, where the chain of evidence, built from soil, metal, bones, and paperwork, now had to confront the most uncontrollable factor in any criminal investigation: human testimony. The first formal interrogation session took place in a tightly controlled environment, without aggressive confrontation or excessive psychological pressure tactics, because the investigative team understood that in a case spanning more than 6 decades, coercion or heavy-handed pressure could produce inconsistent statements easily discredited later. The suspect, now of advanced age, entered the session with the familiar initial defensive posture, denying direct responsibility and claiming to have been only a small part of the broader context of infrastructure maintenance activities at the time. However, the careful phrasing of questions gradually elicited details he could not entirely evade. When questioned about his presence in the southern part of the county during the late 1964 period and subsequent years, his initial answers attempted to remain vague and general. But under cross-referencing with specific employment records, timelines, and types of vehicles used, the suspect was forced to admit to having worked in that area far more than officially recorded. It was at this point that the interrogation began to shift from confirming presence to clarifying what had actually occurred at the scene. When presented with images of the buried service vehicle, the victim's belongings inside, and the stratigraphic analysis conclusions, the suspect could no longer fully maintain a complete denial strategy. Details about concealing the scene emerged slowly, not as a full immediate confession, but through fragmented, sometimes contradictory answers that reflected an internal struggle between continued silence and acknowledging events from long ago. The suspect described discovering an unusual area during work, initially not fully grasping the consequences, but gradually his account revealed that he had recognized the presence of bodies and personal items, a moment that, according to his telling, led to an instinctive rather than calculated decision to cover up rather than report. When directly questioned about the reburial action, the suspect explained that it did not occur immediately after the initial event, but after a period of time, when mounting work pressure and fear of legal consequences accumulated, leading to the decision to return to the scene to clean up anything that might implicate him. This explanation, though subjective and self-justifying, aligned disturbingly well with the scientific analysis of the reburied soil layer and the time frame of intervention, causing the investigative team to realize they were hearing a narrative that might reflect the truth, at least structurally. The reburial explanation was not accepted wholesale. It was continuously tested by cross-checking every small detail against existing evidence, from descriptions of terrain and vehicle position to the sequence of actions recounted. In many instances, the statement inadvertently confirmed details that only someone who had been present at the scene could have known. When the suspect described how the service vehicle was used as a confined space and later buried to avoid detection, the team compared this account with forensic conclusions regarding carbon monoxide and non-immediate injuries, finding significant compatibility between the words and the scientific data. Linking the statement to physical evidence became the most important step of the interrogation, because this was the point where the suspect's narrative no longer stood in isolation, but was placed within a network of independent evidence, each piece both verifying and limiting the possible interpretations of his account. When questioned about the footwear impressions at the scene, the suspect did not deny wearing work boots throughout his employment, and although he did not directly admit those prints were his description of the boot type, duration of use, and working conditions inadvertently narrowed the possibility that they belonged to someone else. The interrogation process was not aimed at forcing an immediate legal guilty plea, but at reinforcing the sequence of events, establishing the order of actions, motive, and level of awareness at each point in time. In a case this complex, understanding the chain of decisions was no less important than determining the final outcome. When the session concluded, there was no dramatic full confession, but the investigative team had obtained what they needed: a statement sufficiently detailed, consistent, and compatible with the physical evidence to reinforce the overall picture of the case. This statement, when placed alongside forensic data, stratigraphy, employment records, and collected physical evidence, not only filled remaining gaps, but also established a coherent timeline of events from 1964 through the reburial years later, transforming previously parallel hypotheses into a logical sequence that could be presented in court. For the investigative team, the statement did not bring complete relief, as it could not erase decades of loss or reverse consequences, but it marked an important milestone, the moment when the truth began to be spoken not only through mute evidence, but through the very words of the person who had helped keep it buried for more than 60 years. From the statements that have been cross-checked and corroborated with evidence during the interrogation phase, the investigation moved into a decisive threshold when the suspect agreed to point out other locations which, according to him, had been previously overlooked or deliberately concealed in the past. This development was not impulsive. It occurred only after many hours of clarifying legal boundaries, with the presence of the attorney and key investigators to ensure that every direction given would be accurately recorded, verifiable, and not subject to misinterpretation. The newly indicated locations were not far from the original crime scene, but sufficiently offset in direction and elevation to explain why the search efforts in 1964, and even the subsequent expanded searches, never reached them: a low-lying area obscured by dense vegetation and terrain structure that made it appear as a seamless continuation of the forest slope, giving no indication that human intervention had ever occurred beneath the surface. When the forensic and geology teams approached this area, the additional excavation was carried out with an even higher degree of caution than in previous phases, because the investigative team understood that this was no longer just about finding more evidence. It represented the potential to complete the picture of the fate of all the remaining victims. Coordinates were marked. The surface soil was removed in thin layers, and within the very first hours, the soil structure already revealed familiar signs of intentional disturbance, similar to those previously recorded at the location where the buried utility vehicle was found, a repetition that reinforced the reliability of the tip. As the excavation went deeper, the first discoveries did not come from human remains right away, but from highly identifiable personal items scattered within a narrow radius, as though they had been moved and then repositioned in a non-random order. The appearance of these items itself confirmed that the investigation team was in the right place. The discovery of the remaining victims unfolded in a heavy gradual sequence, layer by layer, as bone fragments began to emerge beneath the compacted soil, first scattered, then gradually forming structures sufficient for forensic experts to determine that these were the remains of young individuals whose age and characteristics matched the profiles of the two victims who had never been found. There was no scientific ambiguity. The location, depth, state of preservation, and association with personal items matched the description in the statements and the forensic predictions in a disturbingly precise way. When the remains of the remaining victims were brought to the surface, the scene was paused to re-establish full forensic protocol, ensuring every detail was documented for the completion of the death records, not merely to confirm death, but to clarify the relationship between the victims, their positions in the chain of events, and any differences in the manner of concealment. Experts noted that the arrangement and degree of burial indicated that not all remains had been handled at the same time. There may have been multiple interventions, a detail consistent with the statements about returning to the site at different points to clean up what remained. The completion of the death records proceeded in parallel, with each victim documented separately, including find location, bone condition, signs of trauma, and indicators related to the previously established cause of death, to ensure that each death was recorded independently and not lumped together or oversimplified due to the complexity of the case. Initial analysis results showed clear similarities in signs of hypoxia and non-immediate trauma, reinforcing the hypothesis that the victims had experienced the same sequence of lethal conditions, even though their final resting places differed, an important finding for comprehensively reconstructing the sequence of events. Final identity confirmation was not based on conjecture but on standard scientific methods, including dental comparison, bone analysis, and where feasible, DNA comparison with archived family samples. As the results came back confirmed one after another, for the first time since 1964, the case was no longer classified as missing persons but shifted to a status where all victims could be named. This moment was not marked by declarations or ceremony, but by the controlled silence at the scene, where everyone understood that an irreversible milestone had been reached. All victims had been found, and no space remained for ambiguity to persist in the records. For the investigative team, completing the additional excavation and final identity confirmation did not bring a sense of closure, but rather a transformation. From this point forward, the questions no longer centered on where are they, but shifted to what will be done with this truth, both legally and ethically. As the remains were transported for processing according to protocol, the scene was preserved one final time, and reports were updated to reflect the new reality. The case file reached a level of completeness that investigators in 1964 could not have imagined, one in which every victim had a name, a location, and a confirmed cause of death, and the chain of events from disappearance to concealment was no longer a fragmented story, but a continuous flow supported by both statements and physical evidence. From the moment all victims had been located and final identities confirmed, the investigation entered its most decisive yet quietest phase, where the entire effort no longer took place at the scene or in interrogation rooms, but focused on piecing together, systematizing, and conducting a final review of every piece of evidence to form a complete criminal file, capable of withstanding any legal challenge. The investigative team's first task was to assemble all evidence collected throughout the re-investigation, from physical items such as remains, the buried utility vehicle, footwear impressions, reburied soil layers, to forensic results, toxic gas analysis, DNA data, employment records, the suspect's statements, and archived documents from 1964. Each piece of evidence was placed into a clear classification structure, not only by type but also by its role in proving each element of the criminal offense, ensuring no detail was overlooked or misplaced in the overall argument. This process was not merely filing paperwork, It was a reverse analysis effort in which the team continually asked whether each piece was truly necessary, whether it duplicated other evidence, or whether it risked creating contradictions if misinterpreted, and if so, it had to be explained or eliminated before the file was handed to prosecution. A complete timeline of the case was reconstructed from beginning to end, starting from the moment the 4 victims left town in 1964, the events of the night they vanished, the time of death as determined by forensics, the concealment and reburial actions that occurred over subsequent years, all the way to the new discoveries and the 2025 reinvestigation, with every time marker tied to specific evidence rather than speculation. Completing this timeline held special significance because it allowed prosecutors to present the case as a continuous logical sequence of events rather than a collection of scattered findings stretched across more than 6 decades, while simultaneously ruling out alternative scenarios inconsistent with the verified data. During the timeline review, the team paid particular attention to gaps that had existed in the old file and were now filled by scientific evidence and statements, from explaining why no footprints led away from the campsite, to the mechanism that created the lethal confined space, and the reasons the scene was altered after the initial event. Once the event structure was unified, the next step was drafting the indictment, a process requiring close coordination between investigators and prosecutors, because not every identified act could or needed to be included in the formal charges. Legal elements were carefully weighed, from selecting appropriate charges for the concealment behavior and the suspect's role, to assessing the ability to prove each element of the crime in court given the passage of so much time. The investigative team and prosecution jointly reviewed options, eliminated charges that risked weakening the file due to difficulty of proof, and focused on the core acts most strongly supported by physical, scientific, and consistent testimonial evidence. Drafting the indictment was neither emotional nor aimed at compensating for the years the case remained open. It focused on building a durable file in which every charge could be defended against rigorous cross-examination. Preparing for prosecution thus became both a technical and strategic phase. As prosecutors began constructing how the case would be presented to a jury, determining the order of evidence, how to explain complex scientific concepts such as stratigraphic analysis or signs of hypoxia in bone, and how to connect those elements to the suspect's specific conduct without relying on inference. Internal mock trials were held to test the presentation, with prosecutors playing defense attorneys to raise the toughest questions, forcing the investigative team to defend every detail and conclusion, and in doing so, discovering points that needed further clarification before entering the actual courtroom. All documents were standardized. Every chain of custody was re-reviewed from the beginning, ensuring no procedural vulnerability could be exploited to exclude critical evidence. For the investigative team, the phase of completing the criminal file carried a different kind of pressure than the days of excavation or interrogation, because this was when they had to accept that their work would be judged not just by colleagues, but by the legal system and the public, and any mistake could overshadow years of effort. When the final file was closed and ready for formal prosecution, it was no longer a collection of unanswered questions as it had been in 1964, but a complete, structured document in which every piece of evidence had its place, every time marker had its basis, and every conclusion was supported by specific data. At this point, the case no longer belonged to the investigators or forensic experts. It was handed over to the judicial system, with the confidence that what had been so carefully and honestly assembled would withstand the upcoming trial process, and that the truth, though late, had finally been prepared for presentation to justice. From the moment the completed criminal file was transferred to prosecution and the court accepted jurisdiction, the entire focus of the case shifted to a completely different arena, where every discovery at the scene, every forensic conclusion, and every statement gathered during the investigation had to be restructured into a coherent legal narrative, strong enough to persuade not those who had lived with the case for years, but a jury encountering the chain of events for the first time, beginning in the summer of 1964. The trial opened in a heavy but disciplined atmosphere, without sensationalism or emotional framing, because the prosecution determined from the outset that this was not a case to be told as a tragedy, but as a logical structure in which each piece of evidence played a defined role in proving criminal responsibility. The presentation of the indictment followed a strict order, beginning with the establishment of undisputed facts. 4 victims went missing in 1964, were found deceased many decades later, and the scene clearly showed acts of concealment and reburial. From that foundation, the prosecution guided the jury through the complete timeline constructed by the investigative team, explaining why the victims could not have died from a simple natural accident, why a confined space and toxic gas was the only reasonable mechanism of death, and why the presence of the buried utility vehicle along with personal items could not be explained by coincidence. Forensic testimony became the central pillar of the trial, as this was where science had to confront doubt and cross-examination head-on. Experts were called to explain in detail bone trauma, signs of non-immediate death, indicators of hypoxia, and the presence of toxic gas inferred from bone tissue analysis. The prosecution devoted considerable time to clarifying that these conclusions were not based on speculation, on widely accepted scientific methods, while pointing out that every alternative hypothesis, animal attack, getting lost and dying of exhaustion, or terrain accident, failed to fit the actual data. The defense countered fiercely on this point, questioning the reliability of forensic evidence after more than 60 years, the possibility of material degradation, analytical error margins, and the risk of over-interpreting indirect indicators, while arguing that modern science could not fully recreate the 1964 context. Cross-examinations lasted many hours and focused on minute details, from how bone samples were preserved to the chain of laboratory custody, forcing experts to explain not only results, but also methodological limitations. In this process, the prosecution emphasized that consistency across multiple independent lines of evidence was the decisive factor, not any single indicator. When it came time for the defendant's rebuttal, the defense strategy did not seek to deny the findings outright, but instead aimed to sever responsibility, arguing that the defendant had not directly caused the deaths, but only engaged in concealment afterward, driven by fear and lack of understanding rather than malice. The defendant spoke in a reserved manner, admitting to returning to the scene and intervening, but repeatedly stressing that at the time he did not fully understand the legal consequences and believed the matter was already done and unchangeable. The prosecution responded by placing this testimony alongside the established chain of evidence, arguing that the very acts of returning, reburying, and remaining silent for decades directly deprived the victims of any chance of being found, prolonged the suffering of their families, and obstructed justice, and under current law, that conduct was sufficient to constitute serious criminal liability, regardless of whether the initial deaths resulted from accident or not. The arguments revolved around concepts of indirect responsibility, duty to report, and the legal consequences of concealing a death scene, with both sides attempting to interpret the law in their favor, forcing the jury to confront difficult questions about the boundary between mistake, fear, and crime. When closing arguments ended, the jury entered deliberations under special pressure, because they were not only deciding the fate of an elderly defendant, but were also indirectly delivering the final legal resolution to a case that had haunted the community across generations. Deliberations lasted longer than expected, reflecting the complexity of the file and internal debates over the degree of responsibility, but ultimately they reached a verdict based on the principle of reasonably excluding all other possibilities of innocence. When the court pronounced the verdict, The judge's voice was not dramatic but confirmatory. Each count was clearly stated, each conclusion tied to specific legal grounds, affirming that the acts of concealment, reburial, and failure to report constituted crimes under the law, and that the evidence presented was strong enough to meet the strict standard of proof. The court's decision was not framed as the victory of one side, but as the official closing of a chain of questions that had stretched more than 60 years, where truth was established not through emotion or legend, but through the dry yet decisive language of the law. The legal conclusion of the case emphasized that time does not erase responsibility, but it does raise the bar for proof, and for that reason, this case became a demonstration of how the modern justice system can address old files when science, investigation, and law converge. When the trial concluded, the atmosphere in the courtroom did not erupt. There was no complete catharsis, only the heavy feeling of a truth finally named too late, where justice was at last carried out, but could not return the lost decades, and could not make this story's ending any lighter. From the moment the court's verdict was read, and the case officially closed in legal terms, its aftershocks began to spread beyond the courtroom, not in a violent explosion, but slowly and deeply into the life of the local community. For more than 6 decades, the story of the 4 young people who vanished had become part of collective memory, retold through gaps, speculation, and vague warnings. Now, with the truth given a name, the community had to confront the task of redefining a story they thought they already knew. Initial reactions among residents were not uniform. Some welcomed the verdict as long overdue relief, seeing it as proof that the legal system could eventually catch up with time. Others expressed confusion and difficulty accepting it, because the person held responsible was not a distant or mythical figure, but someone who had once existed within the same social space, working in the same system the community trusted. Conversations at coffee shops, churches, and town meetings gradually shifted from what happened to how could it have been hidden for so long, a change showing that community awareness was moving from curiosity to self-examination. The new understanding of the old case did not stop at grasping the mechanism of death or concealment behavior. It also involved recognizing the limitations of past investigations and the role of historical context in shaping outcomes, leading many to look back at the decisions of 1964 for the first time with empathy for the circumstances, but without continuing to accept prolonged silence as natural. Stories once retold as local legend, with eerie and vague elements, were gradually replaced by more concrete discussions about responsibility, professional ethics, and the duty to report when facing deadly consequences, transforming the case from a mystery into an unavoidable social lesson. For the victims' families, the aftershock was more profoundly personal than any public reaction. The court's verdict did not merely close a file, it closed a decades-long state of living in which hope and despair coexisted without clear boundaries. Finding all the remains and confirming final identities brought a form of closure they once thought impossible, allowing them to perform full memorial rituals for the first time, but it also forced them to face the reality that the deaths had occurred long ago, and that the waiting years could never be returned. Some relatives expressed relief that the truth had finally been spoken, while others acknowledged that knowing the details only sharpened the pain, because it placed concrete images into the voids they had previously filled with hope. Despite differing reactions, the common thread was the end of limbo. The question, could they still be alive, no longer haunted them. Instead, there was a definitive truth that allowed them to reshape memory and move forward differently. On a broader level, the case became a textbook example of the impact of reopening cold cases, not only technically in investigation, but also in public trust, when many people realized for the first time that old files do not necessarily have to remain buried forever, and that science, technology, and new approaches can change the outcome of cases long thought lost to time. Law enforcement agencies in the region used the case as a case study, not for self-praise, but to analyze what was missed in the past and what needs improvement now, from record-keeping and detailed scene documentation to evaluating seemingly minor clues. Reopening this cold case was seen as an act of responsibility rather than a search for fame, because it required patience, resources, and the willingness to accept that the outcome might be uncomfortable for the very community that once believed the story was settled. The long-term significance of the case therefore extends beyond the specific sentence. It serves as a reminder that silence, whether maintained out of fear or convenience, can produce consequences just as long-lasting as the original act, and that responsibility does not necessarily stem from malicious intent, but can arise from the decision not to act when one should have spoken up. In the months following the trial, the story of the case was no longer told as a chilling mystery, but as evidence of the complexity of delayed justice, where there is no perfect ending or complete catharsis, only truth put in its rightful place, and a community forced to learn how to live with it. Memorial services were held without fanfare or grand ceremony, quiet and personal, reflecting the community's choice to remember this case, not as a sensational story, but as a piece of history that must be faced squarely to avoid repetition. As time passed, the aftershock of the case gradually settled, not disappearing, but no longer disruptive, becoming a new layer of sediment in local memory, where the questions that once haunted have been answered, even if the price of those answers was acknowledging that justice, when it arrives late, cannot heal every wound. At this endpoint, the case is no longer the story of a disappearance, but the story of how a community, a system, and the individuals involved confronted the truth, after many decades, accepting what cannot be changed, and drawing meaning from what was finally clarified, so that the memory of the four young people is no longer shrouded in ambiguity, but anchored by truth, belated but no longer buried. The Red Hollow story, Indiana 1964 version, leaves a very everyday life lesson for America today. Never consider silence harmless, and build the habit of self-protection through procedure. Four young people, Michael Turner, Daniel Turner, Rebecca Lawson, Thomas Lawson, vanished after what seemed like a normal camping trip. What is terrifying is not only death by toxic gas in a confined space, but the way the truth was stretched across decades, because of one human decision to let it go. Details such as the unfinished campsite, the walkie-talkie emitting only static, the scrap of paper reading South Path, and later, the buried utility vehicle, non-victim work boots, and reburied soil layers, all say the same thing: when something is abnormal, record it immediately, report it through proper channels, and leave a transparent trail, because evidence cannot protect itself. In modern American life, this applies directly to hiking trips, road trips, or even working in agencies. Let loved ones know your itinerary, destination, and return time. Use share location, carry backup batteries, and when encountering abandoned infrastructure, mines, drains, left utility vehicles, do not curiously venture deeper. Leave and report it to rangers or police. At the community level, the case reminds us, don't stay silent out of fear of trouble. The suspect chose concealment and reburial over reporting, causing 4 families to lose more than 60 years without answers. American culture respects individual freedom, but also values civic responsibility. Sometimes, one timely call, reporting a scene, reporting a hazard, or requesting a recheck, can be the boundary between an accident and a tragedy that stretches across generations. If you believe that truths buried as deeply as in the Indiana 1964 case, deserve to be brought to light. Please subscribe to the channel so we can continue pursuing and telling other unheard cold cases. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story, and we'll see you in the next video, where another file, another mystery, will continue to be uncovered.